Right, well, these were crimes, you'll remember, that left an entire state in the grip of a murder mystery. Indeed, it wasn't just WA. I remember being a young woman over here on the eastern seaboard at the time, and what happened in Perth really hit home. Now, a Sky News documentary tells the story of the longest-running criminal investigation in Australian history and the decades-long hunt for a killer. Here's a sneak peek of a survivor in Catching the Claremont Killer, the Untold Story.
That night, do you play that night out in your head?
I try not to, but sometimes you can't help. It's a traumatic thing to be exposed to.
Steve Pennells is a Walkley Award-winning journalist and the anchor of this documentary for Sky. He joins me now from Sydney. Steve, for any of our viewers who aren't familiar with the Claremont killings, tell us what happened in Perth back in the mid-1990s and the prosecution of the killer last year.
Sure. Well, in 1996 and 97, 3 young women went missing from Perth. 2 bodies were found. One still hasn't been found to this day, but that kicked off the longest-running and most expensive police investigation in Australian history. So I think in June this year, it'll be 25 years since a task force was set up to catch the killer. And Australia Day was the 25th anniversary of the first girl going missing. But yeah, like you said, it just, horrified a country. This was a time when, people would go out and, I hate to use the cliche, loss of innocence, but Perth definitely lost something when that happened.
And it's also, you've got to remember, 1990s, you didn't have mobile phones, there were no GPS trackers, you got a lift home in a cab and you basically took everybody on trust.
Yeah,
in and around that time, after these murders happened, and I was, talking about the ramifications for the whole of the country, not just the West, I was really reluctant as a bunch of girls going out. We would never let a girlfriend go home in a cab because that was the rumour for so long that it was likely to be a cab driver or something like that. So yeah. Why did it take so long to convict Bradley Edwards?
That's a very good question. Now, there were a lot of police mistakes along the way. There was some good police work, but obviously there was also some bad police work. And there was a time when they thought they had their suspects. There were a couple of people on the radar. One, a gentleman who's now deceased called Lance Williams, he was harassed for years. And police were convinced that he was the killer, so they had their blinkers on for any other clues or any other signs. I mean, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but if you piece together what we now know about Bradley Edwards and attacks on women beforehand, the dots were there to be joined early on.
We'll talk about those previous attacks. I mean, obviously there's been now all these DNA advances, but you've uncovered a secret victim of Bradley Edwards, Liz Kirkby. Tell me about her.
Liz is extraordinary. I mean, she was one of his first victims, and she was in a series of attacks called the Huntingdale attacks, where what we now know is Bradley Edwards was a 19-year-old guy, and he was attacking women in their homes within a 1-kilometre radius from his house. And he was wearing women's underwear at the time, and he was getting bolder and bolder as the attacks went on. So later on in 95, he raped a woman at Ciara Cemetery. He went on to do the killings. But Liz is quite extraordinary. Her name was suppressed in the court case, and she applied to the court to have the suppression lifted just so she can tell her story tomorrow night. And I mean, you got to imagine how her life has been, ripped apart. I mean, this is a woman who'd moved past the original attack. She was a young mother when it happened. She got remarried, had kids. She moved on, and then a couple of years ago, the police contacted her and say, "Look, remember that attack back when you were a young woman? Well, we think we now know who did it, and we think it's a man who went on to do these horrific murders." So obviously, the trauma has been pretty great for her.
I tell you what, it's terrible to hear you say that she had to apply to the courts as the victim to get the court's permission to talk about it publicly and have her name out there. Good on her. Terrific. I'm looking forward to it. As I said, I think it's a story that has a lot of resonance, but it's still pretty raw for Perth people, isn't it, today even?
It's really raw, and even now, I mean, I'm sure after this goes, I go off air tonight, I'll get calls and texts from people saying, look, it wasn't Edwards, it was someone else. I mean, everyone has their opinion of what happened. Did he work alone? Are there more victims? And everyone's connected. I mean, Perth was then and probably still is now, a city/country town. Everyone knows someone, everyone's connected. And it did change things. Like you said, no one would take cabs. I mean, there was a theory that it was a cab driver or a policeman, so the task force was very insular. Mm-hmm. They didn't, reveal a lot to other police because we didn't know you know, who was killing, and the theory was that these women would not get into a car with anyone they didn't trust. So what car would they trust getting into? And that, you know, that leads to cabs, to police cars, etc. But yeah, it's still really raw for Perth, I think, and it's just one of those extraordinary cases that's fascinated people. But it's horrific, and I feel for the families who've gone through this, and particularly the family of Sarah Spiers, whose body was never found, and they never got closure because he wasn't convicted of her murder.
Well, I hope that changes over time. I hope they do find some remains of Sarah so the family can not move on, you never move on, but put her soul to rest. Steve, thank you. I'm looking forward to it very much.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you.
All right. Catching the Claremont Killer, the Untold Story, premieres tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time only on Sky News Australia.